What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Well, greetings, everyone. Mark Russell here.
Charles Figley.
Charles, hi. So this is episode 8 of Psychiatric Casualties. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to start our discussion, Charles, about the third chapter in our book, Psychiatric Casualties, on the cruel and inhumane punishments that have been administered as a way for the military to manage its mental health dilemma and try to keep those in line, if you would, and maintaining discipline in the ranks by stamping out the weakness, the scourge of war stress injury.
Without knowing what they're doing, without really understanding what people look like as a result of war.
Yeah, no question. And then, how do they deal with, and that's fine for up to a point, but what do you do with your old sergeants now who can no longer fight and who are demonstrating some weakness in a public way? How do you deal with that in order to maintain discipline too? But those were all things that we covered in our previous episode, and so we'll just continue, I guess, this discussion going forward.
But that's a good point question that you had, in that what do you do when you have someone who has been in the military for so long and has been in numbers of battles, and numbers of ribbons of service, and they're acting out now like a couple of the young people do. Do you keep them together or do you separate them? Do you treat them as the same syndrome, or because of the person being older and more mature and have been around a long time and have garnered the respect of people who are making decisions about whether a Marine or soldier gets sent back or not? I mean, it's got to affect the decision making, but one way or the other, it has to be done, and quickly, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and that is a real conundrum in what can be done or should be done, and how do you again separate out those who are unwilling to fight, maybe again through some lack of bravery or cowardice, from those who have fought and fought heroically in many cases, but are no longer capable of fighting because they've proven the age-old adage that every human being has a limit. And it comes to war stress, it's inevitable that we all will break down, given the amount of exposure. So, again, we're talking about corporal punishment or harsh punishment, cruel punishment, in dealing with mental health dilemma of the military. Just to kind of maybe summarize a little bit, some of those forms of discipline that have been used include things like flogging, whipping, cat o' nine tails, barreling, branding, solitary confinement, running the gauntlet, which we didn't talk about earlier, but you can imagine what that is. Tar and feathering. It's a particularly nasty way to manage and discipline. Good example of that is in the HBO series John Adams, which they show somebody being tar and feathered and very in every sense of the word, very torturous behavior. And these were all physical means for the military to stamp out weakness, what it perceived as weakness, and that includes again mental weakness as well as cowardice and things of that sort. And we talk about George Washington and his idea of discipline, and how and these are all efforts to combat again cowardice and mass desertions in the view of the military, maintaining discipline. In 1812, the War of 1812, there was an Army deputy inspector general looked at the hospitals, and he described the medical examinations from flogging. Flogging is the whipping that we talked about. And the IG is quoted as saying, I have seen several instances of men who have received 500 lashes. And I'm aware of one soldier who received 700 lashes. It's hard to imagine the stamina it takes to administer 500 lashes, let alone be the receiving end of that. And again, that could be somebody who's a brand new recruit who decides they cannot fight and they run, or it could be that seasoned sergeant who can no longer fight, and did not make a discrimination between those. But it did prompt, interestingly, it did prompt George Washington's Surgeon General, Benjamin Rush, who urged for more compassion for mentally ill combatants. And Benjamin Rush was not only Washington's Surgeon General during the American Revolution, but was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, right? He's also known as the father of American psychiatry, and wrote the very first textbook, if you would, published in America on psychiatry. It had a lot to say about the effects of war stress that we'll talk about in other episodes. Well, one of these corporal punishments that we were going to talk about is something that occurred during the First World War and also was used in the American Civil War, and that is called Field Punishment 1. Field Punishment 1 is best described as you're basically chaining or tying somebody, a soldier, to a post or a fence or a tree in the middle of a battlefield, and they're left there tied up, and either they're killed by the enemy or their own, through the battle itself, or they're left to, if they do survive, and they're probably even more traumatized, you can imagine, not being able to move or do anything except wait for the inevitable that could happen. But it was a very terrifying way to administer physical discipline to those who might otherwise display some type of weakness. Again, not discriminating between someone who's outright cowardly or yellow from those who have been fighting and fighting heroically, who can no longer fight. But that Field Punishment 1 was something that was particularly distasteful, to say the least. And then there's this issue about occupational therapy. So when I say occupational therapy, Charles, what comes to mind?
Building something.
Well, usually like it's some kind of occupational therapist would be somebody who would be helping people with dexterity of their hands and utilizing their grasping things and improving their ability to use fine motor skills, but also the skills necessary to work, right? And helping rehabilitate people's capacity to work. And that's kind of the idea of occupational therapy as it's used today. Back in the day, like go back to the American Civil War and the First World War, occupational therapy had a whole different meaning. And basically it was those who could no longer fight for whatever reason, right, were assigned occupational therapy, which was the most disgusting, unpleasant, to say the least, type of work imaginable, or that was physically the most like this is like literally breaking stones or something like that, right? But it would be digging and emptying latrines, for example, and carrying all the duties of latrine cleanup. It would be the handling and getting rid of the amputated limbs during the American Civil War, and again, it would be the most grueling, disgusting type of work. And the idea was, by making that occupational therapy more aversive and more distasteful, that the combatants would say, I'd rather go back into the front lines and fight than do this occupational therapy anymore. So it had a much more sinister connotation than what we're used to today, which is more positive and trying to rehabilitate people and get people back to a level of functioning. But then it was used as a punishment to force people, compel people to get back into a war fighting stance.
I can just imagine folks who were going through this kind of experience. Did they actually embrace combat and embrace military order as a result of exposure?
The occupational therapy?
Wow.
Yeah, I think many did. I guess put ourselves in that boat too. I mean, it's kind of like it's a true individual dilemma. What's the worst, the lesser of two evils, right?
Yes.
And for some people, it would be I'd rather clean latrines than risk my life and fight for maybe a war that that they didn't believe in or could no longer fight. And others it would be that I'd rather die honorably, so to speak, with my brothers in arms than picking up shit and dealing with other human remains and things like that. So some did go back. It was the reason why these practices maintain over generations was that they were at times effective. If it didn't work, they wouldn't do it, right? To some degree, at least that's the logic.
Well, when I was in Vietnam, I didn't do that. In part because maybe my rank, but we did it all somehow. Some among the troops, they were chosen and they did it. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they did it as long as they were ordered to do it.
Yes.
But it was, it wasn't the people that were being occupational therapy. It was, our troops doing it.
Yeah, I mean, eventually somebody has to do it, right? So somebody has to build a latrine or empty the latrine. And if there aren't any combat casualties available, psychiatric casualties that do it for you from corporal punishment, it would be the regular troop has to do it, right? Usually the lowest person on the totem pole will.
Yeah.
Or those who are maybe getting in some trouble, and that's a way of discipline from their NCOs is to, hey, you go have latrine duty for a while.
But it also involves the NCOs in supervising or ordering or sitting on them to make sure they get it done and yelling at them, etc.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
caught in the web.
Yeah, like you said, somebody had to do that. I mean, Washington found out during the American Revolution the importance of sanitary to prevent the spread of disease. And so the militaries across generations, have always tried their best to maintain some sense of hygiene. And if it's not occupational therapy as a punishment, somebody else is going to do it. But I guarantee you, if it was you or I, we'd probably view it as punishment if we're the ones having to empty latrines and repeatedly having to do so, maybe. But another example of corporal punishment would be an infamous example that you're probably familiar with, involving General George C. Patton. In 1944, I believe it was, during the invasion of Italy in Palermo. Are you familiar with this story? Okay. So he was visiting his troops after a very long, enduring battle, and the American Army had set up a field hospital in Palermo, Italy. And
it was in the movie.
It was in the movie. They actually, with George C. Scott, right? And that's a true depiction of what happened, except they didn't go into a lot of details. They didn't exactly act out every part of that happened, but because what happened was shocking, and it was published in, I think, New York Times or something to that effect, and that's how Patton got reprimanded for it, and that was depicted in the film Patton. But basically, what it was, he came to a hospital, and his purpose was to award Purple Hearts to those who were medically wounded in the battle that they just fought and were laying in the hospital. recovering from their wounds or being treated for their various physical wounds. And in that hospital laid a few soldiers who had no bandages or had no visible wounds to that you could see. And Patton found these people and started interviewing these soldiers and found out that they were battle fatigue casualties that were laying next to somebody who had been severely wounded or gotten some type of physical wounds in war. And he became absolutely enraged. And I think he was probably a 3 or 4-star general at that time. And, one of America's heroes, really was idolized as one of the best generals in the American Army. And he took this one private, I think it was, grabbed him by the shirt of his uniform and yanked him out of the cot that he was laying on and stuck his pistol. And he carried a revolver with him, and he cocked the pistol and held the pistol to this private's head and told him that he was disgraceful, he was an embarrassment to the military, that he was a coward, and that he was going to execute him as a coward, and yanked him out of the hospital, dragged him out of the hospital with this firearm to his head, and eventually was pulled off of him by his aides, the general's aides, and he relinquished that. But he had slapped and pistol whipped another battle fatigue soldier in that same hospital. And then there were reporters that followed the general everywhere, of course, right? And they happened to, write about the story and made some pictures of that. And so that's what led to his being demoted in rank, but not kicked out of the Army, but he was demoted. And then it was interesting. I read his biography later on, and he talked about that incident. And he admits to having some regret about, maybe the extent of which he used his firearm, for example. But he had no regret on his yanking these people that he viewed as cowards, the battle fatigue casualties, yanking them and separating them away from the physical wounded. In fact, he believed that stigma was the best way to maintain discipline in the Army. And we'll talk more about the weaponization of stigma, but there's a quote in his autobiography, that it was an intentionality behind what he did. It wasn't just a spontaneous react, but it was a means to use corporal punishment in a public way of embarrassing and ridiculing a psychiatric casualty, and to prevent further weakness, as he would perceive it, from spreading amongst the ranks.
Yeah, my ears were perked to hear what his later comments were, but it just seems like he didn't carry it out well, he thought.
Yeah, I think
he still has the same attitude.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
He still has the same attitude.
Yeah, it definitely has the same attitude. And I think if there was any regret, it seems like it was that he had a reporter. He allowed the reporters to be available, and then them writing about it is what led to his public disgrace, right? He was reprimanded. He was told he had to apologize, and he did not want to apologize. I don't even know if he did apologize. It was like a half apology or something to the troops when he gave it. But his heart was clearly not into it. And again, in his view, he was following the line of military leaders from generations in the making, maintaining discipline within the ranks and preventing weakness from spreading, especially weakness caused by the effects of war stress and any psychiatric weakness that was particularly loathsome to military leaders like Patton.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a great positive attitude toward those generals, of course, whenever they did it.
Yeah.
So.
It was interesting. I think it was 2017 or 16 or something like that. But there was another General Patton in the Army that made the news. And I don't remember if he was related to
I thought it was his son.
It might have been a relative or whatnot. I'd have to go back and look, but this patent was in the media for a whole different reason. Was that he's had several combat deployments to Iraq, and he came out publicly as a strong advocate for mental health, and a very forceful view, and admitting and disclosing publicly that he himself had PTSD, and that this is a legitimate injury, and that people ought to be respected who come forward, and we need to get rid of stigma around it, and that these people deserve compassion, and they deserve treatment, not punishment, and things of that sort. So I have to go back and research that if I can find that bit about that. But it struck me because of obviously the last name, right?
No.
Do you know of that patent? Do you?
No, I had heard. No, I'd heard that Patton's son was in the military, but I don't know beyond that.
Well, this would have been like a grandson or something then too, because we're talking. This was just a few years ago. But I'll do some research on that. I'll come back and we'll dispel that. But again, it kind of highlights again this whole struggle the military has with dealing with mental health, and how do we do that and maintain discipline and the military's capacity to fight and win the wars that it's assigned to do. And that struggle continued, and maybe, I don't know, is this the time for us to go into the caging?
Sure.
We want to go into that?
It's on our list. But I think that the notion of I guess I'm thinking of the practitioner rather than as a military officer, and it can be obviously the same. But it seems like if you're in a position of authority, let's say a commander of a battalion, and you're affected by the war, and you know that you're not as sharp as you should be or can be, have a lot of negative memories, etc. Seems like it would be difficult for them to, have confidence at least in their perceptions of his or her men. What do you think? I mean, I guess you're agreeing with me, but you know of any examples?
Nothing comes to my mind right this moment, but yeah, I totally agree with that sentiment. And
let me just jump in, and maybe this will do it. Yeah. There's a very, very good friend of mine in the military. He's not in the military now, but he was in the Marine Corps as an officer, full bird colonel. And he had a lot of concerns about not being his men and women not being prepared sufficiently, and particularly in terms of dealing with trauma. And I really admired him for bringing that up, and that's how I got involved, at least for a year or so, in the crisis of suicides, et cetera, But to be able to be friends with a commanding officer, men, and he has been in battle, et cetera, and knows all the stuff that he graduated from our program. He knows all of pretty much what I have known about combat and the stress and all and the strain, and he never did really. He was never really satisfied with the quality of leadership, and I think probably wrote a dissertation recently. He was involved in it for some time, so I assume he's finished. But it was a very much an interest of his because of the failure of leadership, particularly associated with stress and not being able to manage it effectively and admit that you have these kind of challenges.
Yeah, and I read other other military leaders in different generations in these kind of lessons learned that we kind of talked about earlier that say this kind of similar things, right? Again, through the trials or tribulations of warfare, they relearn these lessons that we need to do something with mental health, that we need to treat it in a different way than what we're doing it now, which is these are the dark side of mental health as we're talking about today. But unfortunately, those voices, they're few and far in between, and they leave the military. They eventually attrit, like we all do. None of us can stay in uniform forever, and there's no intent or agency involved in maintaining those lessons learned, right? And so I hear what your friend and the frustrations that he voiced to and compassion that he had, but I have heard similar voices in generations, each generation, in fact, and very enlightened leaders who are absolutely on the right track. I'll give you, for example, I'm looking at this one quote we talk about. In 1840, there was an Army medical director named Marshall, and he was talking about corporal punishment for mentally ill soldiers. And this was his warning that he gave as part of his legacy, is that, quote, insanity has been frequently feigned by soldiers who wish to obtain their discharge, right? And that's the great fear of the military, is that weakness is contagious and people they'll feign mental health problems in order to get out of their duties. And he goes on to say this, but it is also true, and the fact is a melancholy one, that real insanity has been mistaken for feigned, and the patients treated and punished as imposters. And to me, again, it speaks to that dilemma that you just told too about your friend, right? Is that we have to find a different way. How does the military deal with its mental health dilemma, and also maintaining that force health protection mission that it has too, right? Treating,
that's Joe,
which is really important. Well, which leads us to talk about to me personally, the most egregious example of this dark strategy of using cruel and inhumane punishment to manage a psychiatric dilemma is the caging of Marines. And again, this a trigger warning, which I don't believe in, but is that this information has never been shared publicly and was classified. And well, we save it for last because it to me, again, is the epitome of those efforts the military has taken to try to stamp out weakness, and in this case, at the great expense of those who fought wars. Again, so this is the backdrop to this. The Marines were in Army soldiers as well, so it's not just the U.S. Marines. Were fighting the wars in the Pacific, right? Battles like Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima, Okinawa, etc. And if one of the afflictions for Marines was called Guadalcanal twitch, which was a form of what old sergeant syndrome was the term that he used to describe Marines who could no longer fight, who had been battle tested and fought, but reached their limit, right? They developed what they called the Guadalcanal twitch. But at any rate, so in 1943, the U.S. Army's inspectors general received complaints from family members and from active duty about maltreatment that was occurring on these, what they call Liberty ships, which were the transports that took the Marines and soldiers and sailors from the Pacific theater back to garrison, back to hospitals to get their physical wounds bound, etc. Right? And it raised the concern to the Army Inspector General to go and investigate, because some of the claims were just outrageous. Their initial response was, this can't be true. Not in the 20th century, right? In the modern day military of that time. Well,
which was during World War II, isn't that right?
It was during the Second World War, right? During the Pacific theater. And they're returning home on these deck of these ships. And for most of the returnees, people coming back from those, the island warfare, the Pacific warfare, they were on the deck of these Liberty ships. They were sun tanning, basking in the sun, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, and joking with their battle buddies, right? You could see some of the examples in the HBO series Pacific, which is outstanding, which details, it's kind of like the Band of Brothers, but it takes place in the Pacific theater. But so they're coming back from warfare. They're on these Liberty ships. It takes several months to get back, in transit, and so they're decompressing on their way back to get back home. But not everybody's on the decks enjoying a beer and a cigarette and playing cards, etc. Below the decks, in the bowels of the ship, in the most heated areas of the ship, would sometimes get up to 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. No ventilation, no windows. You're in the bowels of the ship where the engines are roaring, right? And the smell of gas and oil permeates. There in the bowels of these ships, they found Marines and soldiers who coming off of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, who were being housed in wire mesh cages. And these cages, just to give the listener an example, they were 6 feet in length. But if you're less than 6 feet in height, you could lay in without bending. But for those who are taller than 6 feet, you'd have to bend in order to lay in them. But they were only 3 feet high, 6 feet in length and 3 feet high. You could not even sit in the cage. And they had soldiers and Marines, war veterans, who had succumbed to war stress, who were diagnosed with psychoneuroses at the time, or a psychotic reaction. And they were being transported in these cages. Thousands.
For their own safety.
Well, that was the justification. It was for their own safety and the safety of those on board, even though the IG found there was no basis for that. But they're being transported on these Liberty ships in these cages, 3 by 6 feet. So the IG, and this IG inspector name is Kessler, wrote that these ships were going from the Pacific theater to San Francisco, this particular ship. And on this one ship, he quotes, this is coming from him directly, returning Army transports carried most of the mental cases, and the latter were relegated to an undesirable section of the ship that was poorly lighted and ventilated. Fundamentals of care, such as nutrition and water balance, was neglected. Morphine was used as a sedative. Interestingly, there was a big scandal in the recent wars of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who were being treated with opioids, right? Their PTSD, in a kind of similar way that morphine was being administered to these war veterans as a sedative. He goes on to report that there were official recommendations, because this issue had been raised before up the chain of command. And there were official recommendations from different agencies that they needed to stop this practice. And amongst this practice was a branding that was happening to these Marines and soldiers. they were branded with the letters NP. So their uniform was, they were given, they had no identification tag as far as a name. It was replaced with a tag that said NP, and that NP stands for neuropsychiatric. So that was their brand, and they were put in these cages, right? And these official recommendations was we had to stop the branding and stop the caging, but that did not, I guess, get communicated to all the different commands or the ships that were transporting these veterans, because the practice continued. And then it got to the level of the IG inspector, right? So the IG goes on and reports that between April 1944 to October 1944, just that small window, they identified there was 2,980 U.S. war veterans who were diagnosed again with psychoneurosis. At that time was what we would call PTSD today, coming back. And amongst that group, just that one ship, in that short time, there were 19 deaths that occurred in those people kept in those cages. And all those, many of those were suicides, because they were given a brief reprieve to go on deck under escort. They were chained, shackled, and brought up to the decks to get some sun, get some fresh air briefly. And had some of those veterans end up jumping overboard because they didn't want to go back into the cages. And 19 of those resulted in those deaths.
So the 2,980 were from one ship?
One ship.
Wow.
Yeah. So the IG inspectors concluded, after they interviewed some of the ship commanders, the Marine commanders, the people that were in charge, and other crew members, they concluded that in retrospect, it seems unconscionable that such abuses and inhumanities as have already been enumerated could occur in the first place. These abuses included severe overcrowding, lack of ventilation, lack of access to the decks, use of physical restraints, chains, and chronic exposure to air temperatures averaging 105 to 110 degrees during the 14-day trip.
So whose head rolled?
Whose head rolled? That we don't know, if any heads rolled.
But it was going up and down the chain of command. It was in lots of different offices. A lot of people knew about this.
They did.
Remarkable.
They did. And, eventually it did. I mean, the result of the IG is that there was a blanket-wide, supposedly, a war memo sent out that ended the whole practice of caging. Again, this is 1944, and the war ended in 1945. So, it's unknown how many more of these Liberty ships, because back then, word did not travel as easily as it does now as far as communication, and what other commanders actually read those communiques and followed it. Who knows? But I mean, we look back at the lineage, right? The heritage, again, of the militaries going back to antiquity, whether it was the Roman legions doing fusillarium or decimation of combatants who could no longer fight, or the flogging and the barreling and the branding during the American Revolution and the American Civil War, field punishment 1 that occurred during the First World War, and now we have caging in the Second World War, which is not that far removed. We still have World War II veterans that live among us. And so it's not like ancient history.
This is so egregious. And
that's probably why I mean, it is. It boils. I mean, let me ask you, as a Marine, as a combat veteran in Vietnam, the idea that you would transport your fellow Marines and soldiers who are fighting those wars in 3x6 cages with the branding on top of it. How does that sit with you?
It's shocking and unacceptable. And but I would love to somehow be able to communicate with those family members who had they were there, their uncles and
That's right.
brothers and
Husbands.
well, maybe fathers and great grandfathers. Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, it seems it's we owe it to those who died.
Yeah.
Were treated in such a terrible way.
Yeah, and rightly so. The Second World War, greatest generation, and what they did was, absolutely fitting of a great generation. Liberating the world from tyranny, and the sacrifices made. But the same Second World War generation, the greatest generation, also was the start of a trend of psychiatric casualties outnumbering those killed and physically wounded in war. That trend has continued from every war since the Second World War. And they also engage in the physical and mental abuses of psychiatric casualties. But there's also some very enlightened military leaders that were born out of the war, and we'll talk more about their messages and their lessons learned as we in other chapters. But it just repeats. You could pick any generation of any war, and you could find similar kind of examples of how the military mishandles its mental health dilemma, and that's why we call this a dark strategy. And our first dark strategy of the 10 that we've identified, we're only on number 1 so far.
Yeah, this should not pass. This should not be acceptable. And more people need to know about this.
Yeah. So, I mean, other things
what's in it. This is what's possible. That outcome is possible.
Well, remember earlier we talked about misconduct stress behaviors. That term the Army uses to describe the fact that human beings subject to stress can engage in very dehumanizing or different forms of misconduct, right? Including those who they quote, who are good and heroic, can also commit these type of war atrocities. And I put this as a war atrocity. Right.
Oh, yeah.
That those leaders, whoever was responsible for caging veterans up, who fought and bled on the battlefields of Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal and etc., they deserve a whole hell of a lot better than being put in a cage and branded. But that's the extent, unfortunately, the military has gone in trying to manage its mental health problem.
Yeah, I hope we do something about it. We're certainly talking about it. We will bring it up over and over again on this podcast, but it's terrible.
Yeah, it is. And so just to kind of bring this full circle is that I did try to research any contemporary examples in the 21st century, like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for instance, of any similar, physical maltreatment use, of the military implementing punishing, corporal punishment and whatnot to psychiatric casualties. And I could find some newspaper articles. The New York Times had an article, for example, of a couple of Army soldiers who had like 3 or 4 combat deployments to Iraq and then deserted. They could no longer fight, so they left the battlefield and were charged and court-martialed for desertion. And they were put in the brig and they were isolated, but that's kind of the extent of, as far as what I could uncover about physical maltreatment. But I know in my days, I don't know about if you experienced this, but back when I was in the Marine Corps, we would there would be physical discipline amongst the ranks. And I'm thinking back in the Jack Nicholson movie, what's it called? Few Good Men,
Yes,
right?
Last detail.
Yeah,
Last
yeah,
Detail.
in the Last Detail as well with Jack Nicholson, that one too. But Few Good Men had to do with
Few
Jack
Good Men.
Nicholson was a Marine colonel that gave an order for, I think, what they call it, a code red or something. Back then, we used to call it, what was it, a wet blanket party is the term we used. But basically, we would, be as enlisted, we would be asked or told, ordered by either a senior enlisted or an officer to go and rough up a Marine who was showing weakness, physical weakness, who was either falling back on the runs or was constantly making mistakes on the drill field or was not maintaining their appearance, or otherwise not complying with the mission. And we would be in charge of doing some training of that person, and that would involve some physicality. So I don't know if those are examples that continue today in amongst the ranks, but it wouldn't shock me if those stories were available. But I didn't uncover a lot of that in researching this chapter. So that's the good news, I guess.
So in effect, you were not necessarily complicit, but you followed orders and got the kids' attention, apparently, right?
Yeah, I can remember one instance in particular. We were told to give this private a wet blanket party, and basically everyone went around, and this person was in their bunk, and you basically punch them in the gut type of thing, right? Not in the face or anything, but it would. And I did not, honestly, I did not do it. I got up on my bunk and I went over there in order to simulate like I was complying, but I had not the stomach for doing that myself. And others did not comply with that too, but there are a lot who did.
Oh, yeah.
And again, and it's under the guise of trying to maintain good order and discipline, but at this the price of that individual. That is the whole dilemma in a nutshell, right? What does the military do to manage its psychiatric problem, its dilemma, and same time maintain good order and discipline in order to fight and win wars?
Okay, with that challenge,
right.
But it is one that's not going to go away. It is an obvious problem. Do you think, Mark, that the lowering the recruitment challenges of the military is associated with that not working anymore?
Well, I think it's going to create, the recruitment challenges creates a whole nother set of problems for the military, and that is either lowering your standards for enlistment, which means you're going to allow more people in, perhaps, who might create disciplinary problems for you, or have a known psychiatric history. There's a lot of talk about allowing people in, and we have been doing that. Just they have certain criteria for people who do have a mental health history in order to join the military. But so it may be that becomes it could add to some problems for the military in terms of how it's managing its stress. But the other thing related, Charles, as far as modern day sense, is that social media, and we see it now with the riots on campuses and all that, and police body cams, and so there's a lot more surveillance that exists today that would probably account for why there isn't more public display of punishment used in the military, for example. It's not as acceptable. There's more means to grieve if you were exposed to something like that, some maltreatment. So there's there are some things, some policies the DoD has put in place that would make leaders more reluctant to engage in the physical cruelty that previous generations, I guess, enjoyed and got away with, that would not exist today. So if there is a silver lining, I know we like to end on a positive note. If there is a silver lining to this chapter of cruel and inhumane punishment, the first dark strategy, is that there's ample evidence that this is not a widespread problem in a way, that the military has moved on from this particular strategy and how it manages its mental health dilemma. And it has incorporated other strategies, which we're going to talk about future episodes.
This was a good one. We covered ground that, well, as you say, it hasn't been reported widely, and I'm highly motivated to find out more about this and to somehow say, see what happens, don't do this.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, as we end here, to write us and ask us questions and let us know where you are in this regard, especially those of you who have looked through the book. Is there anything that, that excites you that you want us to know about, for example? So,
yeah, and I would add, Charles, to that too, that if any listeners have personal examples or observations of physical maltreatment as a way of managing the military's mental health dilemma, that we would be interested in hearing those anecdotal stories too. And again, way to contact us is you can email me at mrussell, 2 S's, 2 L's, at mrussellphd at gmail.com. And that would be any type of messages that you want or items you want Charles and I to respond to or to talk about in future episodes. We'll do that. And as we end this episode, I could say in a preview for our subsequent episodes, as we're going to talk about executions and legal persecution as the second dark strategy and how the military handles its mental dilemma. So we're just embarking on this whole story.
But, we want you all to get the background of why we wrote this book and why there's lots of work to be done. So we want to share it with everyone, and you can join us in our efforts, etc.
Amen. Yeah. All right. On that positive note, let's end here. We appreciate your listening, and we look forward to any feedback you might have. Be safe and take care out there.